friends. Welcome back to ABN's Trinity channel for another episode of Colliding Worldviews. It's been such a blessing to have so many people joining us for this show that's been happening for almost a year now, but specifically the last 3 weeks and the few weeks to come, because we are in the midst of a special end of the year 7-week series, the historical critique series with Dr. J. Smith. He was here the first 3 weeks when we covered why are there two compilations of the Quran, what happened to the 9 earliest Quranic manuscripts, and also why are there 4 Islamic Qiblas. If you did not see those first 3 episodes of the series, please go to the Trinity channel's YouTube channel to check those out. Also, my Vimeo channel, vimeo.com/Tony Gourlay, and you can find those shows that we've already done that a lot of people are raving about with all the content that was given. Again, this is a 7-part historical critique series. Today, for part 4 of the series, and we're asking what is the Andalusian problem? But Dr. J. Smith is not with me today. I am honored to have as my guest one of my Islamic studies professors, and that is Dr. Daniel Janasic. He is an adjunct professor of apologetics, historical theology, and Islamic studies at Southern Evangelical Seminary, as well as Columbia International University. After earning a bachelor's degree from the College of William and Mary, he went on to earn a Master of Divinity and a master's degree in Muslim Studies from Columbia International University. However, he didn't stop there. He went on to earn a PhD in Historical Theology from London School of Theology. Dr. Janasic is also the author of this book, John of Damascus, the Trinity and Christian Apologetics in Early Islamic Period. John of Damascus was the first apologist to the Muslims. That's been out for quite a while now. If you don't have a copy, just go to Amazon.com and you can get yourself one. But you can also here shortly pre-order Dr. Janasic's next book, which is called A Christian's Guide to Islam, What Every Christian Needs to Know About Islam and the Rise of Radical Islam. Now, again, you can find those anywhere where fine books are sold, but also check out Dr. Janasic's website, danieljanasic.com. Dr. Janasic, it's great to see you again, and welcome to Colliding Worldviews for part 4 of this historical critique series.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to see you again and to be a part of the show.
It's amazing series that we've had so far. A lot of people are enjoying it, and we're so thankful for our viewers around the world. We want to encourage people, just like the past 3 shows that we've done in the series, this 4th one, share it with people because people need this information. Dr. Janasic and I both have a heart for Muslims. We see them as people made in the image of God who need a savior. They need the gospel, and Christians need to be better equipped to reach Muslims who are out there. So Christians get equipped and prepare to share this information with a Muslim if the opportunity arises. If not, again, the gospel is the main thing that we want to be sharing. And again, this 7-part series isn't apologetics. Apologetics is defending our faith. This is more about polemics and critiquing the faith of someone else. Now, today, we're talking about the Andalusian problem, and the book that Dr. Janasic and I have both looked to, but he is, of course, has even more information as well. But here's another book I have for you to show on the screen. It's called The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, Muslims, Christians, and Jews under Islamic Rule in Medieval Spain. This is by Dr. Dario Fernandez Morera. And Dr. Janasic, what was your first take on this book when you saw it and just started reading through it? Because I was loving it.
It's amazing. It has so much information that discounts what we hear day after day about the obfuscation, the cognitive dissonance that is put out on through the media about Islam and how tolerant Islam was. So it was great to have a book that dealt specifically with primary source material from that time period, not secondary source material, not something that was written 500 or 1,000 years after, but material that was written at that time.
And the excellent part about this, as you know, Dr. Janasic, is that Dr. Fernandez Morera, of course, speak Spanish, read Spanish, and all of that. So he's actually looking to the Spanish primary sources that were coming out around this time or shortly later. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, about the last quarter, or no, maybe not even the last quarter, I'd say the last third of this book, right? I'm going to show the viewers here. This much of the book is endnotes. That is how much Dr. Fernandez Morera has done his homework. I was thinking, man, this is a long chapter. All of a sudden, it's like, over 100 pages here of endnotes of all the resources that he looks to. Now, he gives you the resources. He says, okay, here who they were authored by. Here's the names. He'll give you a lot of Spanish resources. So unfortunately, if you can't read Spanish, understand Spanish, you can't really look those up or whatever. But he gives you a lot of English sources, Spanish as well. Great book, very informative, and it just is one more piece of the puzzle that lets us know, look, this definitely goes back to Muhammad himself. There were like maybe Muslims taking a break here and there, but I mean, Muslims are basically just doing what Muhammad said to do.
That's very true. That's very true.
So this is why it's so important, is because people today, Dr. Janasik, we have people who say, look, terrorism, I mean, this started, 50 years ago. I mean, people who are living right now, if you ask them where did terrorism come from, they basically think of what happened in their life. I mean, you have young people looking at 9/11. Oh, that was the beginning of terrorism. You have a little bit older people saying, oh, it was Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran and all that stuff. We need to look beyond our lifetimes. We need to look back to 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, and so on years ago, 1,400 years ago being the time of Muhammad. But, Dr. Janasik, for our viewers who are unaware, what time period are we talking here when we're talking about the myth of the Andalusian paradise?
Well, we're dealing with a time shortly after the conquest began in the Middle East. They went across North Africa, and then the Muslims conquered a lot of the North African Berbers, and it was the force of the Berbers under the Arab leadership that went into Spain in the early 700s. So 711, so think of 9/11. Well, that's 9/11, September 11th. But 711 AD, all the way through about the 15th century. So think about Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue. He was actually doing that because he was trying to find another route to the East Indies, to the West Indies, to India, to China, to do trade, because there was a blockade between Europe and India, and that blockade was because of the Middle East, because of the Muslims. So actually, we owe the Muslims a favor there, because it was because of that blockade, because of that difficulty, that Christopher Columbus was looking for another route. But that's when the Spaniards reconquered Spain and took it away from the Muslims. So we're talking about a good 700 years or more.
And yet we have a bunch of sources to look to, and Dr. Fernandez Morera has done all of us a service in compiling this book. We actually was going to have him on the recent International Apologetics Marathon, and he wanted to be in it, but he's actually busy right now translating this book into Spanish so that could be actually sold in Spain. And how much do people there, of course, need this information as well to learn the history of their own hometown or home country and where they are? So very, very important. But Dr. Janasik, what are some things that scholars say who promote the view that Islam was a positive influence during its rule over Spain?
Okay. Well, just to finish out that time period, because we're talking about Al-Andalus. That was the Arabic name for Spain, whereas the regular name was Spania, but they called it Al-Andalus. And it was supposedly a place of tolerance, even though it was conquered by Islam, ruled by Islam. The myth that Morera is talking about in his book is this whole idea that it was a tolerant place and that Jews and Christians were free to worship just as we would think about them worshiping here in America. But that was not reality at all. Now, there are a lot of scholars today that promote this positive view of Andalusia, Al-Andalus. And for example, there's one, David Levering Lewis, who says that the Arabs brought one of history's greatest revolutions in power, religion, culture, and wealth to Dark Ages Europe, as they were generally religiously tolerant. So he talks about that tolerance. Another scholar, Colin Smith, said that the perspective paints the Muslim culture as, quote, respectful of Christians and Jews as people of the book, and maintains that modern historians seem to agree that the invasion was not particularly cruel or destructive. And then another said that it maintains that the Quran is a source of tolerant behavior, and jihad is merely an inner struggle rather than a violent and large-scale conquest. So one thing that Morera does in the book is that he deals with this concept of jihad as a violent process, as a dominating force of conquest. And he does a very good job of showing from the primary source material, from the writings of non-Muslims who were there being subjugated, being conquered, and showing what they said. Now, some other comments of these liberal scholars today would be such as these. This is from The Economist. Quote, Muslim rulers of the past were far more tolerant of people of other faiths than were Christian ones. For example, Al-Andalus's multicultural, multi-religious states ruled by Muslims gave way to a Christian regime that was grossly intolerant. You'll hear a lot about this multicultural and multi-religious state, and that's probably because that is one of the agendas of the left. They want to bring about a multicultural flavor for America, and they feel like they can bring in this sense of what they believe was a tolerant state. Another professor from Yale University said this, Maria Rosa Menachal. She said, quote, the new Islamic polity in Spain not only allowed Jews and Christians to survive, but following Quranic mandate, by and large, they were protected. So it talks about the protected class. We'll talk about that dhimmi class, D-H-I-M-M-I, because that comes up a lot. And then finally, Tony Blair weighs in, and he said the standard bearers of tolerance in the early Middle Ages were far more likely to be found in Muslim lands than in Christian ones. So here we hear from Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, the great scholar on Islam. But when we look at Morera, we see something very different. And this is what Morera said, quote, far from a land of tolerance, Islamic Spain was marked by religious and therefore cultural repression in all areas of life and the marginalization of Christians and other groups. All this in the service of social control by autocratic rulers and a class of religious authorities. So this is the premise that he has. And I just wanted to read from his book before we go on, just a couple sentences. This is on page 2. This is his thesis. And he says, this book aims to demystify Islamic Spain by questioning the widespread belief that it was a wonderful place of tolerance and convivencia of three cultures under the benevolent supervision of enlightened Muslim rulers. As the epigraphs throughout the book illustrate, the 19th century romantic vision of Islamic Spain has morphed into today's mainstream academic and popular writings that celebrate Al-Andalus for its multiculturalism, unity of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, diversity and pluralism, regardless of how close such emphasis is to the facts. And if you read the book, you'll see that these romantic views that started in the 18th century and continue through today through these liberal scholars, you'll see that they do not fit the facts very much at all.
And as Muslims spread into North Africa and into Spain, on some maps you will see Iberia, Iberia. Of course, as we read in the book and as we've seen throughout time, Muslims have changed the names of territories that they have conquered. And this is a pattern that's happened throughout history. Now, some people may think, yeah, but this is Spain. They're not going to be following Sharia or anything like that. We actually have here in the book on page 10 at the bottom, 11 on the top, if you happen to have the book with you right now, the Maliki school dominated Al-Andalus, and the Ahadith and Sunnah were as authoritative as the Quran. So we see that Sharia, the Maliki school in particular, was prominent in Spain and was being implemented at that time. And Dr. Janasi, you just mentioned dhimmis, or a third-class citizenship or citizenry, as a second-class citizens or third-class citizens, of basically paying the poll tax, the jizya, just to basically stay alive. I mean, you have that third choice. It's not just convert or die, but it's pretty much pay me to not kill you. Pay me under submission, and so that you can technically still follow Sharia, or not do anything that's against Sharia, I should say. A little bit of freedom there, but of course not much. But it's not like, hey, if you pay the jizya and you become a dhimmi, well, then you have all the freedom to do whatever you want. You're still living under Sharia. And this is what was happening at this time. And again, Dr. Fernandez Morera has done all of us a great service with this book. I want to encourage you to get that book in addition to Dr. Janosik's books, because he has great information in his as well. But this is a very important topic for people to know about, because as I said before, Dr. Janosik, when people say, hey, where did all of this start, the terrorism and all this stuff, it wasn't in our lifetime. It wasn't in our grandparents' lifetime. We need to look back, and we can go all the way back to the time of Muhammad, which technically is where we need to go, because we say, hey, he defined Islam 1,400 years ago. But it's not like things were bad for a time and then they got better, and all of a sudden, 1,300 years later, all of a sudden it got bad again. This has been a pattern of Muslims moving into new areas. It wasn't defensive fighting. They spread as far as they did because they were offensively fighting people and spreading Islam and giving people, the choices: convert or die. Or again, Christians and Jews, you have the third choice. But it's very important information for people to have. And what were some of the realities that Morera uncovered in his book that you really don't find in any other books out there?
Well, he dealt with this positive view of multicultural tolerance that these scholars have mentioned, and what he does a great job of bringing up a lot of these quotes from scholars throughout the book, and I really appreciated that, because they were showing that they were trying to say that there was a golden age at this time that we should recapture and bring back to our culture today, without realizing what was really going on, what the reality was. For example, Morera argues that its promotion has been more to advance a vision of medieval Islam as being enlightened and tolerant than to objectively study the historical evidence. And this is some of the evidence that he uncovered. First of all, the chronicles that he reviewed, and these were chronicles written at that time, chronologue dealing with the events as they were unfolding. First, the chronicles, he said, and eyewitness accounts from this time period record ruthless invasions where churches were pilfered and burned or converted to mosques, all the way up, even across North Africa before the Berbers came across, and then into Spain as these groups came in. And the Spaniards were not prepared. They were fractured in the sense that they were living a life of ease. They had their estates. They were not so concerned about each other, and they really did not have the unity that they needed. So they were conquered pretty easily within about a 10-year period. Now, as the Muslims came in, libraries were burned, just as they were in Zoroastrian Persia and Christian Alexandria. Crosses were destroyed everywhere, wherever they were found. There are even accounts where the leaders, the Muslim leaders, said to the warriors, "Okay, break them up. If they're golden crosses, break them up first, so that they cannot be recognized as crosses, and then pass them out as booty." Morera says that there are religious and political persecutions, inquisitions, beheadings, impalings, and crucifixions that reached a height that had never been seen before in Spain. And then slavery was rampant. Slaves made up one of the main exports from that time period. And indeed, many Christian women were taken as slaves. They were sought for their beauty. In fact, that's one reason that a number of Berbers came up into Spain, was because of these stories of these beautiful women who were for the taking. And so that was all part of it. And then Christian men were made into eunuchs to guard these harems of these captured slaves. So there's a lot going on that Morera pointed out to.
And I'm spending a long time on this book because he has so much information in here, so many endnotes, so many references to other sources that you say, hey, I want to get that too. Just a ton of information. It's not like heavy reading, like, hey, this, I can't understand it, but it's just heavy in that he has so many, like I said, a third of the book almost is endnotes. He's giving you references in, Spanish sources, English sources, and all of that. But he has done his homework, as you can see. Again, get this book. It has a ton of information in here. And we see, just as we've seen as Islam has spread into other areas, he talks about the slaves called either Spanis or Mozarabs. And we see that Spain, like Palestine, the entire Middle East, etc., are considered waqf, or an alienable Islamic bequest. So not only do we see today Muslims who are trying to get back these territories that they had, say, 300, 400, 500, 700, 1,000 years ago. But what also plays into this, Dr. Janasic, is the whole Islamic worldview that the original religion of the entire world was Islam, and that everything belongs to Allah. And then, of course, this religion got corrupted, and then we get Judaism, we get Christianity, and all that. So when a person becomes a Muslim today, they're not converting to Islam, but more specifically, theologically speaking, they're reverting to Islam, because they're coming back to the true monotheism, quote unquote, that everyone is born with. And the whole idea that if you or me or anyone out in the world today is not a Muslim right now, well, theologically speaking, we're an apostate, because we're not a Muslim. We haven't submitted to Islam or to Allah. And this is the case when it comes to these territories, and how it's talking about Spain, saying, hey, it's like once owned by the Muslims. Well, it technically always is owned by the Muslims, and all they need to try to do is work their way back into that territory. Now, we're seeing the Islamization of Europe and all different countries. We're seeing a slow Islamization of course, Canada and even the United States to a degree. But, all we need to do is look to Muhammad himself and those primary sources, but then again, these sources for what was happening hundreds of years after Muhammad, when Muslims were just doing what Muhammad said to do, and they were continuing to spread Islam. On page 23 at the bottom, it says, when the Maliki school talks about jihad, it refers to war against infidels, a sacred combat, a holy war, or holy struggle, which always refers to the same thing. Now, Dr. Janasic, you know that there are Muslims today saying, oh yeah, jihad, it can be outward fighting, but mainly it's like an inward thing. I don't know of any Islamic "Your Best Life Now" book out there. I guess that's what they're claiming. But jihad, if we look at all the times that the Quran talks about it, it pretty much all the time it's outward fighting, and this is how Islam spread so much and got from Arabia, even if it did start in what Dr. Smith and I have been talking about the last couple of weeks in Petra rather than Mecca. But either way, I mean, to spread from Arabia, northern Arabia, central, whatever, into North Africa, into Spain, and to go east and all these different countries, it was not defensive fighting like some Muslims will try to claim. And all we need to do is look to the sources. And again, this is just one of them. Dr. Janasic, your book on John of Damascus is another great resource that people need to get. But when we look to the information that he has here, why do Muslims, as well as liberal scholars, feel the need to promote medieval Spain under Islamic rule as a time when Muslims were tolerant and benevolent to their Christian and Jewish subjects, when this was not historically accurate based on this resource as well as other primary sources and all of that? What is the agenda here that people throughout the world, especially in the West, need to be made aware of?
Well, let me segue into that and just touch on some things that you were bringing up as far as the sense of jihad, because he, as I said, Morera does a very good job of tracing this through. And, there are two senses of jihad that Muslims talk about today. They talk about the greater jihad being the internal struggle that we have with our own selfishness and sin. And then it's the violent jihad. That's just the lesser jihad, and that's not the important one. But yet, Morera is showing that throughout this period of Al-Andalus, the violent jihad was the only jihad that was spoken of. You mentioned the Maliki school, and it was the Maliki school that was the most important at that time. It's a very strict, and it was unfavorable to non-Muslims, and it was instituted throughout the area in order to maintain Muslim control. And they were not against killing others for power. Power was their source of looking at Allah as a god of power. So killing and violence was a major method for social control. So when we look at this question that you mentioned about the Muslim scholars, why do they feel that they need to bring this back up? Well, as I looked at this, I realized that there were two Europes that they talk about, that atheists and secularists talk about. They say that one was a Muslim Europe, and it was secure in its defenses, religiously tolerant, and maturing in cultural and scientific sophistication. And then they say, and then there was the other Europe, the Christian Europe, and that was an arena of unceasing warfare in which superstition passed for religion and the flame of knowledge sputtered weakly. Now, these are the words of David Levening Lewis, who's a professor of history at New York University. He's one of many of these scholars who seem to delight in downplaying Christianity, the role of Christianity, and trying to say that Islam was so much better at that time. But there's a distorted view of historical events of that time. Anthony Wilde, who wrote a book on coffee and mentioned the history, said this, quote, European culture had, since the sack of Rome in AD 455, gone into a dramatic decline known as the Dark Ages. Middle Eastern culture, by contrast, was flowering with the added impetus provided by the new religion of Islam. So they saw Islam, or they see Islam back then, as a force that they want to pull into the present as a way of taming Christianity, they think, and bringing about a new sense of tolerance. But they do not know the real history. And that's why this book by Morera is so important, because he takes us back to that time And he shows us that it was a brutal time, a time of intolerance, a time when Christians and Jews were practically slaves of that in that time. They had to pay this jizya tax, a head tax, to keep their head year after year. And it was not a time that was very tolerant at all.
And this is
And I
something that
wanted
people
to
need
mention
to
too, if
understand.
I could, Tony.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. There is this sense too of spiritual warfare, because I see that then and now we look at Ephesians 6:10 through 18, where it says that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the authorities, the powers of this dark world, and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Yes, we have this struggle with Islam even today, and especially violent Islam, because there are peaceful Muslims, of course, and those are the ones that we really want to reach out to with the gospel. But there is a lot of violent Islam as well, based on the Quran. It's very explicit. But I think that we need to be aware of this spiritual battle even more so, because it is raging all around us.
Definitely. And we do need to be in prayer. Having all this information or not even having it at all, either way, we need to be in prayer, praying for the Muslims out there, praying for divine appointments as we as Christians seek to reach out to Muslims and share information with them. Again, information hopefully being the gospel. This information here, again, is information to share with other Christians and even non-Christians, but be able to, be prepared to have it ready to share it with Muslims if the opportunity arises. But again, mainly want to focus on the gospel. Of course, back here, Muslims weren't focused on the gospel in any way. They're focused on doing what Muhammad said to do. And we see how Spain was just one of the areas that Muslims had moved into. And again, if we look at a timeline, I want to let people know about a video if you haven't seen it yet. It's on my Vimeo channel, again, vimeo.com/Tony Gourlay. It's a presentation called Unveiling the Facts of Sharia, and it's a pretty in-depth presentation from the time of Muhammad all the way up to now and what's happening around the world. But the Maliki school that was which Spain or Al-Andalus was under at this time, that was actually founded in Medina. It was founded by Imam Malik ibn Anas, who lived from 711 to 795. Today, it's dominant in North and West Africa, from Mauritania to Egypt, and also in Kuwait, Bahrain, part of the UAE, and a very small part of Saudi Arabia. But again, this was the dominant school in Al-Andalus at that time. Again, vimeo.com/Tony Gourlay. You'll be able to see Unveiling the Facts of Sharia, which includes that and a lot more information. We do need to take a short break, so please, in the meantime, find the link to that video on my Vimeo channel. Go to Amazon, wherever you buy books. Go get a copy of The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise. Get a copy of Dr. Janosic's book, John of Damascus, First Apologist to the Muslims. Go to danieljanosic.com. Save that to your favorites as well. We'll be back in just a few minutes with more Colliding Worldviews.
The Digital Tree is now accessible through our Facebook page. Go to Trinity Channel's Facebook and click on the first post that says, "Click here to start experiencing the Digital Tree today." That link will take you to our website, and from there it's as simple as clicking on what you want to watch. For more information, call the number on your screen or visit our website at trinitychannel.com. Islam and the News will now be live on satellites every Friday at 2:30 p.m. Pacific and 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Your Islamic news source with Tony Gourlay will now be broadcasting to North America on Galaxy 19 and to Australia and New Zealand on Optus D2. Tune in on satellites to view this program in addition to our digital platforms. For more information, call the number on your screen.
Welcome back to ABN's Trinity channel for Colliding Worldviews. This is part 4 of a 7-part end-of-the-year special series, the Historical Critique series with Dr. Jay Smith, and today with Dr. Daniel Janosic. It's such an honor to have him here on this show. Very informative show on what was happening in medieval Spain. It supposedly was a paradise over there in Al-Andalus, but as you've already heard, or if you're just joining us now before the break, giving you a lot of information that Dr. Fernandez Morera has been sharing with us in his book, which again, about 1/3 of the end of it is endnotes to all the great research that he did. Dr. Janosic, we hear about this supposed golden age of Islam in this time period. What were the assumptions of the so-called golden age, and how does it fit together with the views of liberal scholars concerning Al-Andalus?
Well, this is a very important topic area because, again, some of the liberal scholars are hearkening back to the so-called Golden Age, a time period from about 750 to 1050 AD, the earlier part of Al-Andalus. And this would have taken place in the Abbasid area over there in Persia, where in Baghdad was the center of their empire, the Abbasid Empire. And so it was kind of a twin time with Al-Andalus in Spain and then the Abbasid period with this Golden Age. And supposedly it was a time of great learning and innovation from Muslim scholars. The assumption is that the West at this time experienced a period of cultural and technological stagnation. And the Renaissance, several hundred years later, was only possible because Islamic scholars had preserved the classical works that were later rediscovered by the West and which stimulated the cultural revival of the Renaissance. So there's this sense that if it were not for the Muslims and their great learning at this time, that we would not have had a Renaissance, perhaps, and we would not have had the scientific age that came after the Renaissance. Furthermore, the traditional accounts of the Muslims maintains that scientific discoveries pioneered by Muslim scholars were later of great significance in Europe's own technological boom. These Muslim advances are said to include the following. These are some of the things that they put forth as discoveries. The astrolabe, which was used for navigation. An early version of the scientific method was put forth at that time. So they claimed to be the fathers of the scientific method instead of Sir Francis Bacon of the European realm. They talk about the development of algebra, algorithms, spherical trigonometry by the Muslim scholars, the introduction of Arabic numerals at this time, advances in anatomy, surgery, pharmacology, and advances in astronomy, chemistry, and optics. These are all things that they're pointing to as a great period of learning that was spurred by the Islamic scholars, and they downplayed what was happening in Europe and even in the Middle East with the non-Muslims. And there's an agenda there because a lot of that really didn't happen the way that they try to put it.
Definitely, and what he presents in this book here is quite different than these either discoveries or rediscovering something. Yeah, I mean, when you move into a territory where there are huge libraries with information that you've never even heard of before, we have a historical account here of caliphs who were saying, hey, if it doesn't agree with Islam, burn it, throw it in the fire. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, they were destroying things. They weren't inventing things. On page 37, again, if anyone has the book out there, it says here, but as both Muslim and Christian sources attest, the Islamic forces were more ruthless and knew how to demoralize an enemy better than any army since the Roman conquest. He actually talks about them boiling Christians, boiling like in hot water, boiling people as a a form of terror in psychological warfare. Now, I mean, even hundreds of years earlier, we read in the Hadith that Muhammad said he was victorious through terror. So as I've said before, why should we be surprised when some of his most devout followers are involved in terrorism as well? That's not just today, but I mean, that's something that sounds like something that ISIS would do. And we're seeing Muslims hundreds of years ago doing this to strike terror in the hearts of their enemies. And even Ibn Khaldun, I forget which page it was, I think it was in the 70-something page, Ibn Khaldun, who many Muslims look to as a great Islamic scholar, he's saying even that the information that he gives debunks this golden age of Islam. And this is a highly revered Islamic scholar who's giving this information, saying, hey, that this is ridiculous to continue to make these claims. Now, defenders of Islam believe that the golden age of Islam produced some of history's greatest thinkers and inventors. So who are some of these people, Dr. Janasic, that some Muslims point to, saying, hey, this is the fruit of Al-Andalus?
Okay. And some of them were from Al-Andalus and others there in Persia. And I'll mention some names and some of the things that they were reported to discover or be a part of. And there was a lot going on for a time, either in Baghdad or in Spain. You have, for example, Al-Farabi, born in 872, Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina around 980, born in 980. They were great philosophers who studied Aristotle and reworked his ideas and brought them into popularity. And these were the Arabic translations that were used by these men. And then these ideas were transferred to the West and kind of rediscovered by some of the Westerners. So there's a lot that is said about that. Ibn al-Haytham and Abu bin Hayyan were famed physicists and astronomers. In fact, al-Haytham was known as the father of modern optics, and he's the one who said that the light doesn't come from the eye. It reflects light from outside, and that's how we see. So he had a lot to say about optics, and he said some really good things. So you're talking about people, Muslims who were thinkers of that time. Muhammad al-Razi was the greatest Muslim physician and is credited with the invention of alcohol, rubbing alcohol. You have al-Biruni, who specialized in multiple fields that included astronomy, physics, mathematics. You have al-Khawarizmi, I always have a difficult time with his name, Khawarizmi, who was known as the father of algebra. So he dealt with mathematical discoveries and even previous ones that he kind of reformulated. And he was known also for algorithm. So somehow from his name you get algorithm. But he was known for his mathematical superior thinking. And then you have Omar Khayyam, who was a great mathematician as well, and also a poet. We know his poetry. And he was also an astronomer. So you have a number of these men at that time, and they were credited with contributing to the cultural splendor and learning that characterized the various Muslim empires, both in Spain and also there in the Abbasid Empire, during this so-called 300-year golden age of Islam. But it wasn't all as we receive it as a time of Muslim invention. There were other things that were going on, and in a sense, they were great borrowers, and that's what we'll talk about next, I guess.
I was going to say, yeah, I have on page 42, the sciences of the Greeks were preserved due to Marwan I paying Christians to translate them into Arabic. So we've talked about intellectual thievery on one of the previous episodes of this series. But what have revisionists said about these Muslim advances?
Okay, well, first, many of the innovations originated from the conquered peoples and non-Muslim thinkers rather than the Arab scholars. So they were great borrowers. They were the ones in power. So they often got the credit. As you mentioned, most of the translations of Aristotle's works into Arabic were from Christian um, writers and translators, especially from this one family, father and son. They translated it first from Greek into Syriac and then Syriac into Arabic, early Arabic at that time, and that was what was used. Also, the Muslims who did contribute to their field did so outside of and sometimes even directly against the religious circles of Islam. They were called heretics. They were outliers. They were not sanctioned by the government in many ways. There were some of the caliphs who promoted some of this learning, but others were very much against what was going on. One Christian scholar, Robert Spencer, actually enumerates some of these examples of how the evidence shows major innovations to be the work of non-Muslims. And these points are supported by other revisionist scholars as well. For example, the architectural design of the mosque, the early mosques with the domes, that's a Byzantine architectural design. And many of these structures were built by Christians, by Byzantine workers. You think of the Dome of the Rock, and that was built in, 691, 692. And that was built upon a plan of Byzantine architecture. The astrolabe that I mentioned, the navigational device, was developed by Greeks long before Muhammad even came on the scene. Now, there were revisions to it that the Muslims were responsible for, so that we must give credit to. And Christians, as Tony mentioned, preserved Aristotle's work during the so-called Dark Ages. And it was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who is a Christian, and his sons who did a lot of the translation of the Greek into Arabic. The first hospital in Baghdad during the Abbasid period was built by a Nestorian Christian, not the Muslims. So the pattern was set up by the Christians. And the first medical text was written in Greek by a Christian priest and then translated into Arabic by a Jewish doctor. So you have those things going on. They mention in this golden age that there was a founding of Al-Azhar, which is the supreme university in Cairo. But there were other schools before that. For example, the Assyrian Christian school of Nispis and monasteries throughout the area that acted as universities and collections of scholarly works and libraries. This is one that really is interesting. The whole sense of what we call the Arabic numerals that we use today. Why they're called Arabic numerals is still a mystery to me, because they're actually based on numbers and symbols that came from India. They're Indian symbols. And the concept of the zero is also from India, not from the Arabs. So Morera points out, quote, even the Arabic script, the alphabet that Arabs use even today, even the Arabic script may have been invented, he says, by Christian missionaries from the Christianized Arab city of Hira in ancient Iraq. And he also adds that the 10th century Muslim chronicler testified that in Iran, the majority of philosophers were still Christian. So to finish this little section, I want to go back to Robert Spencer because he's got a great quote here. He says, quote, Islam was not the foundation of much significant cultural or scientific development at all. It is undeniable that there was a great cultural and scientific flowering in the Islamic world in the Middle Ages, but there is no indication that any of this flowering actually came as a result of Islam itself. It was outside of Islam, and even the Muslims that were involved were considered heretics and outliers, and a lot of their works were burned. and a number of the scientists themselves, the scholars themselves, were persecuted, and some of them killed.
And very interesting quote from Dr. Fernandez Morera on 64, the bottom, 65 at the top. He says, oh, I'm sorry, quoting Ibn Khaldun, again, a highly revered Islamic source. It says here, the Arabs, Ibn Khaldun also writes, barely coming out of their nomadic existence and having become spectators of the way of life in a sedentary civilization, were too busy because of their positions in the armies even to pay attention to scientific knowledge. They made up the highest class in the state and made up the armed force that sustained the empire. They were the only depositors of authority, and what is more, they despised culture. So, to kind of sum up a section of the book is pretty much Greek thought and Muslim culture, or them trying to Islamize the culture. And like you said, taking this, taking that. Hey, yeah, we'll take that. Oh, we don't want that. Let's burn that. Just as they spread into new territories. And of course, this is referring to Spain in particular, Al-Andalus. But what are some of the critiques brought up by the scholars who do not accept the liberal view of the Islamic Golden Age?
Well, of course, this is evidence from Muslim scholars themselves that strongly suggests that a number of these discoveries credited to Islam did not come from the Arab Muslim conquerors, but as you said and pointed out from Herrera, that they came rather from the people they had conquered, especially the Persians, the Greek-speaking Christians educated by the Byzantine system, and the Jews. A lot of these Persians, a lot of the Muslims that I mentioned earlier were Persians, and present-day Iran, for the most part, and they had a vast background and culture before they were overrun by the Muslims. And many of these scholars who made advances with science and technology of that time were first-generation converts to Islam. They had been raised in the education system of the Byzantine Empire or the Persian Empire, which was greatly influenced by the Jews and the Christians. So it was after this time, second generation, third generation, that there was a disinterest and a moving away from these discoveries, and also a so-called closing of the Muslim mind that I want to get to in a moment. But a second main issue that is not raised by Muslim scholars defending the Golden Age is that the Islamic governments did not support a number of these scholars, as I mentioned, especially the ones who rejected the beliefs of Islam. And a number of these that I mentioned were kind of just borderline. They were not very favorable to what the rulers were doing. Therefore, what they accomplished was often in spite of Islam rather than because of Islam. And that's a very important point. And I think Morera makes that very clear in his book.
And Dr. Janasik, we only have about 6 minutes left in the show. Please give our audience some information on the closing of the Muslim mind and the implications of these views.
Sure. I think it leads to one of their greatest philosophers and scholars, and that was Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who lived between 1058 and 1111, right before Thomas Aquinas, one of the great Western thinkers. They were in the same time period. Now, al-Ghazali went through a transition. He was a Sufi. He was more of a mystical type of Muslim, very sharp, brilliant in many ways. And he, in his early life, he saw reason as something that was very important. And so he based a lot of his ideas on logic and reasonable development. But then he came to a point where he saw that philosophy was flawed because it was man's thinking. And he looked only to the Quran. So in his later life, he said, if it's not revelation from the Quran, then it's less than what we need. So he pushed philosophy aside. And he really is responsible for a lot of this closing in the Muslim mind, because even today there is this anti-intellectualism, anti-logic throughout the Muslim world. And so they look at revelation as the only way to really think through the issues. And that's why they go back to the Quran and hold faithfully to the Quran without really thinking through the implications of those views. And what are the implications? Well, one of the main implications is that Islam has not progressed forward, and for the most part is still stuck in the mindset of the 7th century. This also means that most of the early accomplishments came in spite of Islam rather than because of Islam. Most of the Muslims who brought forth new ideas were deemed innovators and therefore heretics. And much of the work that they did was destroyed or later ignored, as Tony mentioned, because they were not interested in the culture. And this is why Sergei Trifkovic, who came out of Eastern Europe in that Muslim arena there in Croatia, he laments that often, quote, the best Muslims, whether judged by intellectual or political achievement, are usually the least Muslim, unquote, which is very powerful to say something like that.
And it's very important for people to understand this closing of the Muslim mind that took place about 1,000 years ago, and Al-Ghazali saying, hey, tradition is more important than reason. The Quran is eternal. It's not created by man. And of course, too, that there is no free will. It's all determinism. There is no cause and effect. It's all inshallah. Allah willed it. That's why it happened. There's no reason to question it or anything like that. And as you said, Dr. Gnostic, a lot of people, this closing of the Muslim mind still affecting many Muslims today. Of course, here in the West, a lot of Muslims who have been exposed to modernity and just Western thinking and critical thinking, logic, philosophy, and all that, we don't see the same mindset of all Muslims everywhere, but we need to look to the East and, what explains where many Muslims still are at today. But with all this information in mind, how can we use this material in order to share the truth of Christianity with the Muslims around us?
Well, as I mentioned, in Islam, reason was made subordinate to revelation and science, as well as innovative thinking, and it was rejected through this closing of the Muslim mind. So it's a great opportunity to show that Christianity is very different. Christians were on the forefront of the scientific adventure. They were the true developers of the scientific method, because they saw God as a creative God who created beautiful, wonderful systems that we're here to explore. And he gave us minds to logically think through these different arenas of information and understanding. And so with Christianity, we can look at creation. We can look at the world around us. We can depend on the laws of God to continue working logically, systematically, consistently. And based upon these laws, we can therefore come up with an understanding of how the world works together. And so it's no wonder that for hundreds of years, from the time of the Renaissance through the modern period, Christians were involved in developing the scientific methodology throughout Europe. They were the ones who made the discoveries. You look at the names of the fathers of all these different sciences, and they were Christians because they believed in a God who was a creative, powerful God who loved us and wanted us to have this knowledge. So instead of the closing of the Muslim mind, in Christianity, we had the opening of the mind to the world that God created, the fabulous world. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, the psalmist says. And I believe that, and Christians who pursued that and still pursue that are at the forefront of the scientific discoveries through the centuries. Even today, even though many scientists have turned away from God, they are realizing that what these earlier Christian scientists have put forth still stands. And they are going back to that and realizing that there has to be a God. And we are the ones who are best able to explain that God, not the God of Islam, not the Allah who is based on power and control, but a God who loves us with an everlasting love and wants us to enjoy this life, to know it, and to be able to enjoy it to its fullest. And he has a great promise of a future that is much greater than what we have now. So that's what we need to understand, and we need to realize that Muslims do not have that understanding. And we have something to take to them. We need to get the message of truth to them, because they're following a message of destruction, a God who is by nature very, very different. Not the God of the universe that we believe in as Christians, but one who is bent on controlling the world, putting people under his thumb and making them slaves. And that's what Islam really means, being submissive to this Allah. And we want to be free. The true God gives us freedom. Jesus said that he has come to give us that freedom. And it's wonderful to be able to accept that and to live by these promises that God has given us. So we need to know and understand Islam better so that we can bring to them the truth of the gospel.
Amen. Dr. Janostic, it's been a blessing to have you here on this part 4 of the 7-part historical critique series. Thank you so much for your time and for giving us this vital information and talking with me about the myth of the Andalusian paradise. What is the Andalusian problem? Well, we just gave you an hour's worth, and we do want to point you to that resource again by Dr. Dario Fernandez Morera. Also, please get Dr. Daniel Janostic's book, John of Damascus, First Apologist to the Muslims, subtitle, The Trinity and Christian Apologetics in the Early Islamic Period. Again, he's going to be coming out with another book in the near future called A Christian's Guide to Islam, what every Christian needs to know about Islam and the rise of radical Islam. Again, you can find out more at danieljanostic.com. Dr. Janostic, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Tony. This was a great pleasure. It's good to see you again.
You too. Friends, thank you so much for being with us. We hope that this show was informative for you. And again, this is just information that we hope that you retain in the back of your mind when you're out there trying to reach Muslims with the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. Muslims are, smart people. They know that this universe doesn't make sense without a creator. The problem is that they have a wrong understanding of who that creator is and what he requires of us. We need to share the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ with Muslims. There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, roughly, and they all need the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. They need to understand who Jesus truly is, not the Isa who's talked about in the Quran, but the Jesus of Nazareth who is found in the New Testament of the Bible. So please take this information and the information we've given you in the past 3 shows with Dr. J. Smith. And please join us next Monday for part 5 of this ongoing end-of-the-year special series, the Historical Critique series, found only here on ABN's Trinity channel. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week for another episode of Colliding Worldviews.